On the map, Russia and China sit side by side across one of the longest divides on Earth, a 4,200-kilometer line stretching through rivers, forests, and frozen ground. But for most of modern history, they may have touched on paper, yet in reality they were kept apart by memory and mistrust. Movement across this frontier was limited. Trade existed, but never enough to make the line feel truly open. Now that is changing. Across the Amur River, new bridges, rail links, energy routes, and freight hubs are turning a once quiet frontier into a corridor of power. China and Russia are not just opening the line between them, they are erasing what it used to be. Before we get into it, like and subscribe for more stories quietly reshaping our world. The line no one crossed. The strange thing about Russia and China is that they were never truly far apart. Their shared line stretches for more than 4,200 kilometers across some of the most difficult land in Eurasia. In theory, this should have been one of the world's great corridors, a natural route between two giant powers. But for much of modern history, it became almost the opposite. This was not a place built for movement, it was a place built for caution. The Amur River marked much of that divide. In summer, it was wide and difficult to cross. In winter, it froze into a hard white barrier. Cities could face each other from opposite banks, close enough to see the lights across the water, but still feel politically and economically distant. Geography made crossing difficult. History made it dangerous. Russia and China were both communist powers, but that did not make them natural partners. Their relationship was shaped by suspicion, rivalry, and a long habit of watching each other carefully. In 1969, that tension even turned into armed clashes along the frontier. After that, the space between them became more than a geographic line. It became a reminder that two countries can sit side by side on the map and still see each other as threats. So the crossings stayed limited. Trade existed, but it never matched the size of the two countries. People moved, but not enough to make the frontier feel open. There were ferries, seasonal routes, and temporary crossings, but very little permanent infrastructure. No major bridge turned the river into a daily commercial route. No real system made movement feel normal. That absence mattered, because when two countries truly expect a relationship to grow, they build the machinery of connection: roads, railways, pipelines, ports, custom zones, and freight hubs. Russia and China had almost none of that along one of the longest shared lines on Earth, and that tells you something. This divide was not empty by accident. It was empty because both sides had reasons to keep it that way. Then, the world changed. Russia's relationship with the West began to fracture. China's demand for energy, food, and secure land routes kept growing. Suddenly, the same frontier that once looked like a liability began to look like an opportunity. The line no one crossed was about to become the place both countries started building. The first crack in the border. The first real change did not come with a speech. It came with steel. For years, the Amur River had done what walls usually do. It kept two countries apart that looked close on a map but stayed strangely distant in real life. On one side was Russia's Far East, vast, resource-rich, and thinly populated. On the other side was northeastern China, crowded, industrial, and hungry for raw materials. The two sides could see each other, but seeing is not the same as connecting. For a long time, crossing the river meant depending on temporary solutions: ferries when the water allowed it, ice routes when winter made the surface hard enough, and slow customs points that never felt like the foundation of a major economic relationship. That kind of crossing can move some trade. It cannot build a system. Then the bridges began to appear. The Blagoveshchensk-Haihe Bridge became one of the clearest signs that something had changed. It did not just connect two cities across the Amur. It connected two roles that had been waiting for each other: Russia as a supplier and China as a market just across the river. Suddenly, trucks could move on a fixed route. Goods no longer had to wait for the season, the ice, or the river. A crossing that once felt uncertain became predictable. And predictability is what trade needs before it can grow. But the road bridge was only the first crack. The railway bridge near Tongjiang carried a deeper meaning because trains do what trucks cannot. They move heavy freight at scale: coal, timber, ore, grain, machinery, and the basic materials of an industrial relationship. Once rail enters the picture, the frontier is no longer just a place where goods pass through. It becomes part of a supply chain. That is the real meaning of these bridges. They are not tourist attractions. They are not isolated engineering projects. They are physical commitments. A bridge says something a treaty cannot. It says both sides expect movement to continue. It says cargo will keep coming. It says the old distance is no longer useful. And this is why the Amur matters. A river that once slowed everything down is being turned into a working corridor. One crossing moves trucks, another moves trains. Future crossings add redundancy, making the whole system harder to interrupt. Together, they begin to erase the old logic of the frontier. The line that almost no one crossed is no longer just a line. It is becoming a route. But Russia and China did not stop at roads and railways. The next project was stranger, more symbolic, and in some ways even more revealing. They began building a way to move people through the air. The cable car between rivals. The bridges changed the movement of goods. But the next project changes something more subtle. It changes the way the frontier feels. Between Blagoveshchensk on the Russian side and Heihe on the Chinese side, the Amur River is not some distant wilderness. The two cities face each other across the water. On a clear day, you can look from one side and see the buildings on the other. Russia and China are not separated here by oceans or deserts. They are separated by a river, a memory, and a long habit of keeping distance. That is what makes the cable car so strange. On paper, it sounds almost ordinary. A short ride across the Amur, a glass cabin moving above the water, people floating from one country to another in a matter of minutes. But along this frontier, ordinary is the radical part. This was never a place where crossing was supposed to feel casual. For generations, the river carried a heavier meaning. It was not just water. It was suspicion, bureaucracy, soldiers, and the memory of a relationship that could turn cold very quickly. The other side may have been visible, but it was not truly accessible. A cable car changes that psychology. It does not move coal like a railway. It does not move trucks like a bridge. It does not move gas like a pipeline. But it moves people in a way that feels effortless. And when crossing becomes effortless, the old idea of the frontier begins to weaken. That is the real power of this project. It turns distance into a short ride. It turns the opposite bank into a destination. It turns a line that once felt heavy and political into something people can experience through daily movement. This is how divides are softened. Not always through speeches, not always through treaties. Sometimes through small repeated acts that make separation feel less natural. A tourist crosses once, a shop opens, a hotel fills, a customs checkpoint gets busier. Local businesses begin planning around movement instead of distance. Little by little, the frontier stops being only a place where two states face each other. It becomes part of everyday life. And once that happens, the relationship becomes harder to reverse. Because infrastructure does not just connect places, it creates habits. It builds expectations. It teaches people, companies, and cities to organize themselves around a new reality. That is why the cable car matters. It is not the biggest Russia-China project. It is not the most expensive. It will never carry the strategic weight of a gas pipeline or a rail bridge. But it may be the clearest symbol of what is happening along the Amur. Russia and China are not only building routes for cargo, they are building a frontier that feels less like a warning line and more like a shared space. And while the cable car makes that transformation visible above the river, the most important connection between these two countries is being built far below the ground, power beneath the border. The cable car makes the new Russia-China connection visible, but the most important part of this relationship is not hanging above the Amur River. It is buried underneath the ground. Beneath this frontier, another kind of connection is taking shape, one made not for tourists, shoppers, or local traffic, but for energy, gas, oil, coal. The raw power that keeps factories running, cities heated, and economies alive. This is where the Russia-China story becomes much bigger than the border itself. Russia has what China needs. China has what Russia can no longer sell as easily to the West. For years, Russia's energy map pointed mainly toward Europe. Pipelines ran west. Markets sat west. Money came from the West. The system was built around a simple assumption. Russia would supply energy to Europe, and Europe would keep buying it. Then that relationship began to break. Sanctions, war, distrust, and political pressure changed the direction of Russian energy. The old Western routes no longer looked secure. Russia needed buyers that could not be easily pressured by Washington or Brussels. China needed energy that did not have to pass through vulnerable sea lanes. The answer was already there, waiting on the map. East. The Power of Siberia pipeline became one of the clearest signs of that shift. It does not look dramatic from above. There is no skyline, no bridge, no glittering station. But underground, it does something far more strategic. It ties Russian gas fields directly to Chinese demand. That kind of infrastructure changes the relationship between two countries. A ship can be delayed, a port can be watched, a sea route can be threatened. But a pipeline buried across land is harder to interrupt. Once it is built, geography becomes dependency. Gas starts flowing, power plants adjust, contracts grow, industries begin to plan around it. And little by little, both sides become tied to the same system. That is why energy routes matter more than headlines. They do not just move fuel, they move leverage. For Russia, these pipelines offer a way to survive the loss of Western markets and keep its resource economy connected to a major buyer. For China, they offer something just as valuable, a land-based supply line beyond the reach of maritime choke points. This is the deeper meaning of the new frontier. The bridges above the Amur move trade, the cable car changes perception, but the pipelines underneath it all create commitment. They make the Russia-China relationship harder to reverse, because once energy infrastructure is built, it does not disappear with one election, one crisis, or one diplomatic speech. It stays in the ground, it keeps flowing, and every year it operates, it makes the two economies more connected than they were before. That is the quiet power beneath the border. Not a symbol, not a photo opportunity, a buried system of dependence. And energy is only one half of the story. Because once Russia began turning east, it was not only gas and oil moving toward China, food began moving too. The grain route east. Energy is the deepest layer of the Russia-China connection, but it is not the only one. Once Russia began turning east, it was not just gas moving toward China, it was food. And food changes the story in a different way. Gas keeps factories running, oil keeps machines moving, but grain keeps people alive. It is basic, it is political. It is one of the few things every government must secure, no matter how powerful it becomes. Russia understands this better than most countries. It is one of the world's major agricultural powers, with enormous fields across its interior and a food export system long connected to routes through the Black Sea, Europe, and other vulnerable corridors. For a long time, that system made sense. Russia could ship grain west, south, and outward into global markets. Then, the world around those routes became more unstable. War, sanctions, shipping risks, and political pressure made Western-facing routes feel more exposed. The same problem Russia faced with energy began to appear in food. If too much of the system points west, then the west can become a point of pressure. So Russia started looking east. And just across the frontier was the world's largest food consumer. China has land, but food security remains one of Beijing's deepest concerns. It has people to feed, industries to supply, and a leadership that does not want to depend only on sea routes, exposed choke points, or suppliers that can be pressured from outside. That makes Russian grain valuable in a way that goes beyond price. Wheat, corn, soybeans, and other agricultural goods can move through rail lines, terminals, and Pacific ports, creating another layer of connection between the two countries. The same frontier that once barely moved people or trade can now become a food corridor. And that matters, because grain is not just cargo, it is leverage. A country that controls energy can influence factories. A country that controls food can influence stability. And a country that can provide both becomes much harder to ignore. This is why the new terminals and export routes along Russia's eastern edge are so important. They are not just about selling more wheat, they are about redirecting the center of gravity. They give Russia another way around Western pressure. They give China another land-connected source of security, and they turn the frontier into something more durable than a political agreement. They turn it into a supply line. That is the pattern repeating again and again along the Russia-China frontier. First bridges, then rail, then pipelines, then grain. Each project looks separate at first, but together they tell the same story. Russia is moving its economy east, and China is building the routes to receive it. The old border was built around separation. The new one is being built around dependence. And when energy and food begin moving through the same corridor, the relationship stops looking temporary. It starts looking structural. This is where the map begins to change. Not with one dramatic announcement, but with the quiet movement of things no country can live without: fuel, freight, and food. And once those flows begin to organize around the same frontier, the question is no longer whether Russia and China are connected. The question is how much of Eurasia will start to depend on that connection. The new Eurasian spine. Step back from the bridges. Step back from the cable car, the pipelines, the rail yards, the grain terminals, and the ports. Individually, Each project can look ordinary. A bridge moves trucks, a railway moves freight, a pipeline moves gas, a terminal moves food, a cable car moves people across a river. But together, they are doing something much larger. They are changing the meaning of 4,200 kilometers. For most of modern history, the Russia-China frontier was a line of separation. It marked where one system ended and another began. It reminded both countries of distrust, distance, and the danger of getting too close. Even when Moscow and Beijing spoke the language of friendship, the land between them often told a different story. There were few crossings, few habits of movement, few physical reasons for the relationship to deepen. Now that old logic is being replaced. The same frontier that once slowed everything down is becoming a working spine of trade, energy, food, and political dependence. It is no longer just a place where Russia ends and China begins. It is becoming the place where the two economies lock together. This is what makes infrastructure so powerful. A political speech can change in a day. A treaty can be rewritten. A leader can leave office. But steel does not vanish. Pipelines keep flowing. Rail lines keep moving. A port built to handle Russian grain does not disappear when headlines move on. Once these systems are built, businesses adapt to them. Cities plan around them. Contracts depend on them. Supply chains begin to follow them. And every year they operate, the relationship becomes harder to reverse. For Russia, this new spine offers a way out of isolation. If Europe becomes less available, the East becomes more important. If Western markets close, China becomes not just a buyer, but a lifeline. Energy can flow east, grain can flow east, raw materials can flow east. For China, the same system offers something just as valuable: security. A land route to Russian resources is harder to threaten than a ship at sea. It does not pass through the Strait of Malacca. It does not depend entirely on distant ports, foreign navies, or exposed shipping lanes. It gives Beijing another direction to pull from when the world becomes unstable. That is why this story matters far beyond the Amur River. Russia and China are not simply improving a border. They are building a system that makes both countries less dependent on the old global order, less dependent on Western markets, less dependent on sea routes, and less vulnerable to pressure from the outside. This does not mean the two countries fully trust each other. It does not mean their partnership is permanent, but it does mean something important. They are making separation more expensive. Every crossing, every pipe, every rail line, every terminal adds weight to the relationship. Not emotional weight, physical weight. Steel, concrete, gas, grain, and freight. That is the new reality being built across Eurasia. The border is still there on the map, but what it used to mean is disappearing. A line that once kept two giants apart is becoming the spine that pulls them together. Russia and China are not erasing their border by removing it from the map. They are doing it in a quieter way, by making the old line matter less every year. A bridge makes movement normal. A pipeline makes dependence permanent. A grain route makes survival part of the relationship. And piece by piece, a frontier once shaped by suspicion is becoming a corridor of power. The question is not whether Russia and China are getting closer. The question is how much of the world will be forced to adjust when they do. Is this a partnership of convenience or the beginning of a new Eurasian bloc? Drop your thoughts below. And if you want to understand the quiet changes that redraw the world before they become headlines, like and subscribe.